Well, Dr. Kelly, thank you very much for your testimony. A lot of data to process, and really appreciate you quantifying all of that. Have some questions with regard to that estimate of the adequacy gap that you have put forward in your testimony here today. In your testimony before the courts, you stated that the adequacy gap was $4.2 billion. That was 2 years ago. In that subsequent time frame, the General Assembly has put records amount of funding into basic education. So can you explain why that estimate of the adequacy gap that you are projecting has grown approximately $2 billion from the testimony that you provided to the court to the testimony that you're providing here today?
Thank you very much, Chair Phillips-Hill, for that question. And so the adequacy shortfalls that I described, as I noted in my testimony, were based on the 2008 formula's definition of what an adequacy target was for a district. And as I noted during trial and in my testimony at the time, that $4.6 billion shortfall was in many ways conservative because it didn't take into account a series of really critical funding areas for districts. And so because, for example, it was connected to the distribution of basic education funding, that section of the school code didn't take into account the need that districts would have relative to special education. And so these estimates do take into account special education, which was not true of the previous estimates. And so
is that the only factor that you had changed from your court testimony until your testimony here today?
Thank you. Yeah. So there's a number of additional factors that are taken into account here that are not taken into account when we calculate an adequacy target using the state's 2008 formula. And so in addition to special education, there's been a dramatic increase since the original costing out study was conducted to calculate and estimate a base cost and the share of districts, their required share of PSERS payments. And so that's being taken into account here and was not previously being taken into account. There's been an increase in the number of students from low-income families since that estimate as well. And this also is using the current weights from the BEF and SEF formula. And so those weights are different and in some cases slightly higher than the weights that were embedded in the 2008 formula. And so there are a number of ways that I've tried to outline as clearly as possible in the written testimony that these estimates are addressing cost areas that have not previously been included. So I wanted to make sure that those are included so it's as comprehensive as possible.
So if you look apples to apples, the number that you provided to the courts in your testimony there, and using the exact same factors based on the massive investment of dollars into basic education funding over the last 2 years, what is the number?
So I would have to run the calculation following the 2008 formula, but one of the things about the formula is it specifies that the base cost will be increased by the Act 1 index. And so the base cost itself will be increasing by the Act 1 index under the 2008 formula. And so the base cost that would be used for a previous year's calculation would be increased by the Act 1 index to adjust for inflation. And so the base cost itself would be increasing if we follow the specific calculations from that 2008 formula. And so we would have to run that calculation, but again, it wouldn't include really critical areas of need for districts. So special education funding, to give one example, would be a large area of need that's not factored in if we were to update that 2008 formula for the most recent AFR data, which would be 2021 to 2022.
So essentially what you're saying is the definition of what you believe to be basic education has expanded to include a multiple additional factors that have not been previously considered basic education. For example, we have a separate special education funding, we have a separate special education commission, and so you are adding additional factors, and that is the result of that increase in your testimony 2 years ago to the courts versus today?
Yeah, so as I noted at the time, the 2008 formula was not comprehensive, and so the estimates that I shared at the time were very conservative because of that. And all of these cost areas, including special education, they're going to impact the resources that a district needs and the extent to which a district is able to provide students with an opportunity to meet the standards the state has set for them. And so what I've tried to do here is take into account as many of those cost factors as possible, though even now I'm still not taking into account cost factors in areas like facilities. I tried to provide an estimate of what an additional cost related to pre-K would be, but that's not embedded in this particular estimate.
So pre-K is not embedded in this cost?
The aggregate figure I shared, yes. But so in the written report, I do estimate, based on an estimate of the number of unserved eligible pre-K students, what the additional shortfall would be if
So
that's
you
taken
are
into
aware
account.
that in last year we had 2,800 unfilled pre-K seats, and we still paid for those seats to the tune of $28 million. Did you factor in that?
So that data was not data that I particularly looked at here, and so in terms of the estimate, I tried to be as clear about it as possible. So I use an estimate of the number of unserved students, and then what the rate would be for each of those students based on the guidance that.
I think it's important to understand that we have 28,000 empty seats, so that would certainly factor in unserved students. I will tell you this, right? I can remember vividly being in graduate school, and Dr. Cliff Zukin said to me, Ms. Phillips, if you remember one thing and one thing only from your quantitative research methods course, it is this: numbers are your friends. They'll tell you what you want them to say. So I think we have to have a really clear idea of what exactly you're including and not including, because it's going to make a big difference to kids and school districts and taxpayers all across the state. The one last thing, if I may, Mr. Chairman, you pretty much assume a status quo for how the money gets into education, right? So have you contemplated or looked at any other ways that we can generate revenue to fund education other than the existing status quo model?
So in terms of the revenue side, I'm focusing on the state's own data's measures and definitions relative to both the goals that it has set for school districts, and then also the specific weighting factors the Commonwealth has identified, which are consistent with what we know from research about the additional costs that districts will encounter. And so I haven't looked as closely at the revenue side or how revenue is generated. My focus here, and that's why I didn't share, for example, the 2008 formula had a state funding target. And so I didn't share a state funding target or calculate that. And so I'm not thinking here particularly about the revenue side. I'm looking at using the state's own measures, its own data, its own definitions, spending within model districts, and what an approximation would be if that was extended to all districts across the Commonwealth.
Very good. I think we have to be concerned both about how the money gets into the system, how the money's distributed throughout the system. So thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chairman.